It is the morning of July 17th, 1943, and somewhere on the scorched steppe west of Prokhorovka, a German Panzer IV sights motionless in a shallow depression. The grass around it is still smoking. The hatches are sealed. From a distance, the tank appears almost undamaged. No catastrophic detonation, no column of black smoke, no turret blown 30 feet into the air. But the crew inside are not coming out. They cannot come out. The hatches that should swing open at a single pull of the latch have become, quite literally, part of the tank itself. The metal around the hinges and seals has fused. The locking rings have seized. What were once precision engineering components, machined to tolerances measured in fractions of a millimeter, are now a single continuous piece of welded steel. And the men trapped within that steel coffin have just begun to understand what has happened to them. This is not an accident. It is not the result of a catastrophic hit, not the consequence of a petrol fire or an ammunition cook-off. This is the result of something the British began working on years earlier, something that emerged from a very specific problem and a very specific solution, something that took a principle of basic chemistry and turned it into one of the war's most psychologically devastating secondary effects. To understand how it was achieved and why it mattered far beyond the mechanics of armor penetration, you must go back to a moment when the entire British Armoured program was facing a crisis it had not fully admitted to itself. By 1940, the theoretical foundations of what would later be called the hollow charge effect had been known in European scientific circles for decades. The principle was simple enough in theory that an explosive shaped into a cavity, lined with a thin layer of metal and detonated at a standoff distance from its target, would focus its energy into a jet of superheated particles, traveling at velocities approaching 8 kilometers per second. This jet was not hot in any conventional sense. It was not a flame. It was not a stream of burning gas. It was a column of coherent metallic plasma moving so fast that the armor steel ahead of it did not need to melt. It simply stepped aside, behaving for a fraction of a millisecond less like a solid and more like a fluid under pressure. The jet punched through by a process closer to hydrodynamics than to any kind of thermal cutting. At the moment of penetration, temperatures at the tip of that jet exceeded 5,000 degrees Celsius. What happened at that temperature, right at the boundary between the jet and the surface of a tank, was the detail that would eventually matter more than the penetration itself. The men at the projectile development establishment and the various research teams feeding into the British anti-tank program understood the penetration problem well enough. What they were beginning to notice, almost as a footnote in early test reports from 1941 and 1942, was what occurred at the periphery of the impact point. The central jet bored through, but the annular ring of energy that surrounded it, the crown of superheated copper splash, the spray of liquefied liner material, the gaseous discharge moving outward and downward along the surface of the target. This peripheral energy had nowhere to go except into every gap, every seam, every hinge channel and locking groove that happened to be nearby, and when it cooled, even in fractions of a second, it did not simply evaporate. It deposited, it filled, it fused. The researchers were not, initially, designing for this effect. They were designing for penetration. But the metallurgical result of a correctly lined hollow charge detonating on or near a hatch assembly was beginning to show up consistently in test data. The copper-rich splash, directed radially outward from the penetration point at temperatures well above the melting point of structural steel, would flow into the clearance gap between a hatch and its frame, a gap typically no wider than half a millimeter, and resolidify there in under a millisecond. The result was a brazed joint, not welded in the formal sense of the word, but functionally indistinguishable. The hatch could not be opened from inside or out without applied force, far beyond what a panicked crewman, lying on his back in a smoke-filled tank, could possibly generate. The British No. 68 anti-tank rifle grenade, which entered service in 1940 and was one of the first purpose-built hollow-charge weapons fielded by any army in the conflict, was not designed with this in mind. Its copper liner, its standoff nose, its shaped cavity were designed to penetrate armor up to roughly 50 millimeters thick, enough to threaten the light and medium tanks the British expected to face in the early years. The welding effect was observed almost incidentally in trials. A hatch assembly placed in proximity to the impact point during an early range test at Shoebury-Ness was found upon inspection to have its hinges fused. The report noted the observation. Nobody initially grasped its operational significance. It was the development of the projector infantry anti-tank, the weapon that British soldiers would come to know simply as the PIAT, that brought the phenomenon into sharper focus. The PIAT entered development in 1941 under the oversight of Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Blacker, and it represented a characteristically British solution to a typically British problem, which is to say it was unconventional, somewhat ungainly to operate, required considerable nerve to use correctly, and worked rather well when everything came together. The weapon itself was a spigot mortar, a steel tube with a powerful spring that drove a fixed spigot into the tail of the projectile, detonating the propellant charge and launching the bomb on a low, arcing trajectory. It made no muzzle flash. It produced no visible backblast of the kind that made the German Panzerfaust, an American bazooka, easy to spot when fired. It could, in theory, be used from inside a building without killing the operator. In practice, the spring was so powerful that cocking it required the firer to lie on his back and use both legs to compress it, which was an experience that described itself. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The PIAT bomb carried a hollow charge warhead with a copper liner approximately 70 millimeters in diameter. Its effective range against armor was roughly 90 meters, though most successful engagements happened at considerably closer distances. The warhead, when it functioned correctly, could penetrate approximately 75 to 100 millimeters of homogeneous steel plate, enough to defeat the frontal armor of a Panzer III or the side and rear armor of almost any German tank it was likely to encounter. But the testers at Fort Halstead and the research teams feeding back from operational experience in North Africa began compiling something more interesting than penetration statistics. They were building a picture of what happened to a tank, not when the jet went straight through the armor and ignited the interior, but when the round struck in or near a hatch assembly, or when a well-placed shot at the hull side detonated close enough to a hatch ring that the splash crown reached the seam. In documented test results from 1942 and early 1943, impact points within roughly 15 centimeters of a hatch edge consistently resulted in hatch seizure. The copper splash, which spread in a cone roughly 40 degrees wide from the axis of penetration, reached temperatures at the outer ring of the impact zone still sufficient to liquefy the alloy steel of typical German hatch hardware. The clearance gaps in Wehrmacht hatch design, which used a pressed steel seal and a rotating locking ring operated by a handle, were, by catastrophic coincidence for the men relying on them, almost perfectly dimensioned to accept and trap a thin bead of resolidified copper alloy. The gap was large enough to receive the material. It was too small to allow the resulting bead, once cooled and bonded to both surfaces, to be broken by hand from inside. The tactical implication was straightforward. A tank crew that survived the initial penetration of a hollow charge round, whether by the shot missing the crew compartment directly, by being deflected, or by the vehicle having sufficient armor to stop the jet, while still experiencing the peripheral effects, found themselves in a vehicle they could not escape. The hatches that should have been their way out were held shut by a line of brazed copper no wider than a finger. The fire that was almost certainly beginning somewhere in the vehicle, whether from burning hydraulic fluid, smouldering ammunition packing, or the ignited wool of a crew member's uniform, would proceed at its own pace. The men inside had no recourse. German after-action reports from Tunisia and later from the Italian campaign began noting a pattern of tank losses in which the vehicle was disabled but not destroyed, and the crew was found dead inside with hatches apparently undamaged. British intelligence analysts who reviewed these reports in late 1943 were among the first to formally connect the metallurgical observation from the test ranges to the operational evidence from the field. The connection was not, apparently, a surprise. The surprise was how often it was happening. There is an important distinction to draw here, and honesty demands drawing it. The British did not deliberately design the PIAT warhead to weld hatches. The effect was emergent, a consequence of physics that the hollow charge principle produced regardless of intent. What the British did do was recognize the effect early, document it systematically, and in subsequent warhead development, take care not to design it away. That is a different thing from designing a weapon specifically to trap men inside burning vehicles. It is also a different thing from discovering the effect and ignoring it. The surviving documentation at the Public Record Office suggests a middle course. The effect was known, considered useful, and accommodated. The specific geometry of the copper liner in production PIAT warheads from 1943 onwards was optimized primarily for penetration, but the standoff distance and liner angle that maximized penetration also happened to maximize the lateral temperature of the splash crown. The engineers knew this. The German response when German ordnance teams began understanding what they were dealing with was to attempt to improve hatch sealing materials and to widen the clearance gaps in new hatch designs so that infiltrated material would not bond to both surfaces simultaneously. The Tiger I's hatches, which had been criticized within the Wehrmacht for being difficult to operate under pressure, were in later production variants given slightly looser tolerances. The Tiger II went further, with hatch locking mechanisms moved to a different position relative to the hatch seal, reducing the overlap area where a brazed bead could form across the joint. These were not headline modifications. They did not appear in technical press releases or propaganda. They appeared in production engineering change orders filed at the Henschel Works in Kassel, and they tell a quiet story about how seriously the problem had been taken by the people who had to solve it. The Americans were aware of the effect through liaison with British technical teams, and the shaped charge warheads for the American M9A1 bazooka incorporated a liner geometry that produced a similar but somewhat weaker splash crown. The result of a slightly different liner alloy and a shallower cavity angle. American field reports from the Pacific and from Italy noted hatch seizure effects less frequently than equivalent British reports, which is consistent with the metallurgical difference. The Soviets, who captured significant numbers of German hollow charge munitions and reverse engineered them extensively from 1942 onwards, documented the hatch welding phenomenon in their own technical literature, but do not appear to have optimized their warhead geometry to produce it. The British documentation on this specific secondary effect remained classified into the early 1950s and was not included in the shared technical intelligence exchanged with Soviet counterparts during the wartime alliance. The Germans themselves attempted a shaped charge anti-tank weapon, the Panzerfaust, that produced its own version of this effect, though in a somewhat different form. The Panzerfaust's warhead used a steel liner rather than a copper one, which produced a jet of lower temperature and different particle characteristics. The peripheral splash from a Panzerfaust strike ran cooler and deposited a material less suited to forming a coherent brazed bead. German technical analysts who compared Panzerfaust and PIAT impact forensics noted the difference explicitly. The PIAT splash, they observed, produced a bonding quality that the Panzerfaust did not reliably replicate. The chemical composition of copper, its melting point of 1085 degrees Celsius, its low viscosity when liquid, its tendency to wet and bond to steel surfaces under pressure, made it substantially more effective at infiltrating and fusing within the microstructure of a steel joint than the iron alloy splash of a steel-lined warhead. The full scale of the effect on German tank crew morale is difficult to quantify with precision, because German military psychology records from the period are fragmentary, and many of the relevant unit diaries were lost or destroyed in the final months of the war. What survives is consistent. Interrogation reports of captured Panzer crew members from 1943 and 1944 contain repeated references to fear, not of death from a penetrating hit, but of being trapped inside a burning vehicle after a hit that did not immediately kill the crew. This fear was specific and articulated. Crew members described checking hatch function before mounting their vehicles, a practice that had not been standard before the North African campaign. Some described greasing hatch seals with engine grease before operations in an attempt to prevent bonding, a field expedient that had limited metallurgical effectiveness, but that speaks clearly to the level of anxiety the threat had generated. A tank crew's ability to exit their vehicle rapidly was not a secondary concern. It was, in the minds of men who had seen what burning petrol did in an enclosed steel box, the primary concern. The PIAT and the hollow charge principle the British had developed and refined had made that concern specifically and measurably worse. The operational legacy of this effect extended beyond the Second World War. Post-war analysis of shape-charge warhead design incorporated the hatch sealing phenomenon as a formally documented secondary damage mechanism, distinct from spalling, overpressure, and crew incapacitation through incendiary effect. The development of tandem warheads in the Cold War period, which used a precursor charge to defeat reactive armor before a main charge penetrated the base plate, drew explicitly on accumulated British understanding of the splash crown geometry and its effects on adjacent hardware. The man in a contemporary anti-tank missile design team who adjusts the copper liner angle to control the temperature profile of the peripheral splash is working, whether he knows it or not, in a tradition that runs back to a test range in Essex in 1941, and a note in a report that remarked, almost as an aside, that the hatch assembly in the adjacent test fixture had been found to be seized shut upon inspection. Original PIAT projectors can be examined at the Tank Museum in Bovington, Dorset, where the weapon is displayed alongside examples of the warhead it fired. The copper liner, removed from a training round and sectioned for display, looks almost unremarkable. A pressed cone of reddish metal, shallow and smooth. It is perhaps 90 grams. Standing before it, knowing what it was designed to do, and knowing what it did as a consequence of doing that, one is left with an impression that is not quite awe, and not quite horror, but something in between. The engineering is elegant, the physics is indifferent. The consequences were endured by men in steel boxes who had no way of knowing, in their final seconds, that the thing preventing them from opening a hatch was a bead of metal no wider than a wedding ring. Return to the morning west of Prokhorovka. The tank is still there. The grass has stopped smoking. The hatch remains sealed. In the decades that followed, military historians would count the tank as a loss and move on to the aggregate figures, the divisional tallies, the strategic assessments. The hollow charge effect would enter technical literature. The copper liner angle would be refined. The classified reports would eventually be opened, read, and filed away again. But the physics of what happened at that hatch seal, the brief liquidity, the infiltration, the rapid cooling, the bond, happened in under a millisecond and left no record except in metal. The British had not invented a way to kill tank crews, they had invented a way to keep them precisely where they were, and in the arithmetic of armoured warfare, where the difference between a crew that escapes and fights again and a crew that does not often determine the outcome of the next engagement, that distinction mattered enormously. A simple copper cone, a standoff distance, a liner angle chosen for penetration, but shaped by the same geometry to spread its heat exactly where it was needed. The Germans had tanks that could take a hit and survive. The British made sure that surviving the hit was only half the problem.